Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar, Managing Common Garden Invasives with Dan Snider. This webinar is presented by the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway, which is a collaborative project between the Woodstock Land Conservancy, Woodstock Transition, Woodstock Environmental Commission, and the Catskill Center. Our presenter tonight, Dan Snider, is Fields Project Manager at the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership, otherwise known as CRISP. CRISP is hosted by the Catskill Center and is also a collaborative of organizations and agencies working cooperatively to promote prevention, early detection, and control of invasive species. A question and answer period moderated by Del Orlowski will follow Dan's presentation, and the event will conclude at 8:30 p.m. You may post your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the program. To make sure that our Q&A moderator sees your question, please do not post it in the chat box. Use that Q&A box. So let's get started with managing common garden invasives with Dan Snider.
All right, can you guys hear me all right? Great. Thank you, Carolyn, for that introduction. You actually covered a lot of what I was going to talk about, covering the introduction of CRISP and the Catskill Center. I'm going to share my screen now. All right, can you guys see I hope that you can see my presentation now. All right, so as Carolyn mentioned, I am the Field Projects Manager at the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership, or CRISP, as I'll be referring to it throughout this presentation. So CRISP is a large region. It's that green region on this map that you can see here. It encompasses the entirety of the New York City watershed, and well, not the entirety of the upstate New York City watershed in pink. And then it also encompasses the Catskill Park blue line here in blue. So the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership is one of 8 partnerships for regional invasive species management that exists throughout New York State. Here I've got a map showing all of the partnerships or PRISMs. That's Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management there. Each PRISM is hosted by a different nonprofit organization in the respective region of that PRISM. And they work with local partner groups like private companies, hiking and fishing clubs, local governments to prioritize, manage, and teach about that region's specific invasive species infestations and needs. So the Catskills region, where we are, is over 70% forested. We have a larger pressure of forest pests, things like emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid, than like the lower Hudson prism, which is to our south, or the Lisbon prism. And if you go further out west, in western New York and Finger Lakes, you'll find a higher incidence of giant hogweed than you might find in the CRISP region. So each region has different invasive species needs, which are prioritized, organized, and managed through a partnership based on one of these 8 prisms. So CRISP covers all of Otsego, Delaware, and Schoharie counties, most of Greene, Ulster, and Sullivan counties, and a small part of Orange County, just down here at the bottom, which makes up about 3.3 million acres of the greater Catskills watershed. And as Carolyn mentioned before, CRISP's mission is to promote the education, prevention, and early detection of invasive species to limit their impact on the ecosystems and economies of the Catskills. Before I jump into the invasives portion, I should mention that CRISP is hosted by the Catskill Center, which is a nonprofit located in Arkville. So the Catskill Center hosts and operates CRISP, and it also advocates for increased funding for the Catskill Park. It serves as a land trust operating several preserves, as well as the Catskill Visitor Center. It works to promote conservation of and the safety of the New York City watershed. The Catskill Center is doing a lot to promote the ecological and economic well-being of the Catskills. So tonight I'm going to be talking about common invasive species of the Catskills. As I mentioned, the Catskills is 70% forested, but a lot of that forest is broken up into small patches, and so we have a lot of invasives that threaten those edge habitats. We have a lot of invasive species that threaten highly disturbed areas, so meadows, fields, forest edges, roadsides, that kind of thing. I'll be talking a lot about invasives that tend to thrive in those areas and how best to manage them without resorting to pesticides. Before I jump into all of that, I want to cover what makes an invasive species, because the term can be a little nebulous sometimes. Some things that we think are invasive might actually be native and just be a nuisance. Some things that are native might end up being so aggressive that they act like an invasive species, even though they are native to that range. So specifically for CRISP, for it to be an invasive species, it has to be non-native to whatever area that you're talking about, and it has to cause some form of harm to the environment or the economy or human health. Not many of the species relevant to the Catskills put human health at risk, but some of them do. I mentioned giant hogweed a little earlier. We don't have too much giant hogweed in CRISP. Wild parsnip is another invasive plant that can harm human health. I'll be talking about that later tonight. Typically, the reason that an invasive plant can cause harm to the environment or to the economy is because of their fast growth rate, fast reproduction rate. Sometimes they have some attributes like allelopathic chemicals that they might put out into the soil that suppress growth of other species around them. But typically invasive species will share fast growth rates, rapid reproduction rates, high germination rates of the seeds that they put out, phenotypic plasticity, which means that they can adapt readily to many different environments and circumstances, and they're environmental generalists, which again just means that they can spread very readily across many different areas. In the picture here, we have kudzu over the course of 1 year, just growing up over an entire structure there in the background. I want to share with you one of CRISP's and the larger PRISM network's prioritization tools that we use for invasive species, just to frame the invasive plants that I'll be talking about tonight. So let me get my mouse awake again. Here we go. Yep. So this curve here, the invasion curve, basically represents the area of an infestation of an invasive plant or insect or animal increasing over time. And it shows in these blocks typically the type of management perspective that you have to take depending on how long a particular area has been infested, how well entrenched it is. Usually at CRISP and other prisms, we try to focus our attention down here in the tier 1 and tier 2. So we try to, of course, prevent an invasive species from ever coming to to our region in the first place. That's the easiest. You teach people about it. You teach people not to plant it, and hopefully that is enough to prevent a species from coming in. It's very hard to hit 100% prevention, and so then we move to eradication, which is most easily done immediately after a species is introduced to an area. And this can be at any scale. So CRISP focuses on prevention and eradication at the regional scale across that 3.3 million acres. So we're focusing mostly on species that are relatively low populations across 3.3 million acres. Whereas tonight I'll be talking about species that might be tier 3 or tier 4, Japanese knotweed, Japanese barberry, that kind of thing, species that are very widespread throughout that 3.3 million acres. But on your property, these species may be at a tier 2 or even a tier 1. You may not have these species at all, which would make it pretty easy for you to locally eradicate that species if you have it in low populations or you know it was just recently introduced. So even though something like Japanese knotweed would be pretty unmanageable in terms of eradication at the regional scale, at a local scale, eradication and suppression is definitely possible. And this is just another look at the invasion curve. Again, I mentioned that at CRISP, we try to focus mostly on education, focused on prevention of potential invasive species that might come in from our surrounding regions. And then we focus on eradication of those species that have just recently been introduced and represent a large potential threat based on how they're growing in, again, our neighboring regions. Tonight, I'll also be talking about IMAP Invasives, which is a phenomenal tool. I hope everyone who's listening to this presentation goes and makes an account at IMAP Invasives. It's totally free. The reason I'm plugging it is because it's actually the state, the New York State invasive plant, insect, animal database. So this is where the state collects all of our information about invasive species presence and absence, spread, treatment, all of that goes into this database. And the more people who are using this database, because it's publicly sourced, anyone can make an account and put information into the database where it is then double checked by a state recognized expert. But the more information that we have in this database, the better our decision making can be at that regional level. So again, I'll be talking a little bit more about invasive species later in the presentation, and I hope to sell every single one of you on it. So tonight, let's see. Tonight I will be talking about, again, those common tier 3, tier 4 invasive plants of the Catskills region. Japanese barberry, Japanese knotweed, mugwort, honeysuckles, all of these are incredibly widespread, incredibly stubborn, hard to get rid of, especially without pesticides, which is, of course, a big focus of the woodstock pollinator pathway. We don't want to use pesticides because they can also negatively impact those pollinators that we're trying to encourage. I'll just say briefly that in some cases, like large populations of Japanese knotweed, if you are wanting to completely eschew pesticides, it's important to reframe your objectives, because some species like Japanese knotweed are just so aggressive that mechanical control alone might be able to temporarily suppress the population with aggressive mechanical control, but eradication of a large established population of Japanese knotweed with mechanical control alone is not likely. I'll get more into details of that a little later. But management is definitely doable. Eradication may be out of reach for some species without herbicides, but management is doable. All right, so getting into Japanese barberry. I want to talk about Japanese barberry here. It is actually banned for sale, banned for transport, or banned for introduction in New York State. There are a few specific cultivars that are allowed for sale within the state because they are supposedly sterile, but they're basically on a watch list. If they are seen to be spreading, no longer sterile, they will be banned as well. I would never recommend planting barberry anyway, but you can recognize Japanese barberry by its small, oval, smooth leaves. It has yellow flowers hanging down in small umbels, and it has those red berries that persist into winter. I also want to mention Japanese barberry's connection between high populations of ticks, or with high populations of ticks. Multiple studies have shown that areas that are infested with Japanese barberry support higher populations of ticks, and higher populations of ticks means that there's a higher incidence of Lyme disease among those ticks. Basically, the shrub creates a really humid microclimate in the area underneath it, and that allows the ticks a warm, humid environment in which they can look for their blood meal for longer. So ticks that are growing underneath barberry have an increased reproductive capacity, or they have increased odds of reproducing. And one study out of Connecticut found that barberry infested woods can support over 10 times the amount of ticks per acre than non-barberry infested woods. So if you're concerned about Lyme disease and you know there's Japanese barberry on your property, one thing you might do to help bring your tick populations down is remove the Japanese barberry. As far as invasiveness, Japanese barberry creates a really thick, dense patch that outcompetes and shades out the native understory. They're definitely difficult and painful to walk through. I showed the close-up of the spines on the previous slide. I talked about the high tick populations. Again, back to that, those shared traits of invasive plants. Japanese barberry has a very high seed production and viability, and it can also spread vegetatively. The arcing branches that you can see here can take root when they touch the ground. There we go. As far as control of Japanese barberry goes, manual removal, if you don't want to dig it up, repeat cutting or even mowing can work eventually if you do it aggressively enough and repeatedly over many years. You have a pretty large root stock of nutrients and energy below ground that you have to fight back and deplete. So you're going to have to continue going over multiple years, not to mention the seed stock that you have to combat against. When you cut back the shrub, you're increasing the light availability to the forest floor, and Japanese barberry has been growing there, it's been dropping seeds there. Japanese barberry is what's going to come up from underneath the barberry that you've just cut. So you have to be really vigilant about pulling those out or digging them up. Controlled burning can work. I want to take this second here to talk about, to just specifically say directed flame weeding, controlled burning are really, like, they're very effective for a lot of woody shrub species and some herbaceous species as well. But they are risky, and they should really only be done if someone has had training in those techniques. That being said, controlled burning can work pretty well for large infestations of Japanese barberry. Root grubbing, which is basically just very thorough digging up of the roots, works extremely well. The roots are pretty easy to find. They're bright yellow. They have that berberine chemical in them. So it's pretty easy to tell if you've missed some as you're digging it up. Goat grazing can work. It's sort of similar to mechanical cutting or mowing, you'll just have to bring the goats back for multiple years. And of course, the easiest way is to avoid introducing it in the first place. Don't plant the Japanese barberry. Moving on to Japanese knotweed. So Japanese knotweed, I think most of us are pretty familiar with. It grows about 15 feet tall, maybe taller in some areas depending on the site. It has a bamboo-like stem with very characteristic knots throughout the stem, which are hollow. I find it also has a pretty characteristic smell when you're going through and snapping the stalks or cutting them up. It has this, I think, pretty attractive flower. Late in the season, bees do really enjoy it, and it completely takes over riparian corridors and really anywhere that is fairly wet. So it can take over field edges as well. I should also mention that it has extremely extensive root systems, up to 40 feet long in some cases, which is partly what makes it so incredibly tenacious and difficult to get rid of, especially if you're only able to do mechanical control. As far as invasive effects, Japanese knotweed can limit access for recreation to stream banks for swimming and fishing. It completely shades out native plants. You barely get anything except knotweed growing under knotweed. And that can weaken the stream banks just because there's not a lot of variety underneath there, which can lead to erosion, and then you have large flood events, which can also rip apart the Japanese knotweed. And I don't think I mentioned it yet. Maybe I mentioned it in the next slide. No, I don't. One of the other big things about Japanese knotweed, besides its immense root system, is it spreads incredibly aggressively vegetatively, which just means that most plant parts of Japanese knotweed can take root and create a new plant. So a bit of stalk of the Japanese knotweed that's 2 or 3 inches long is all it takes for a new plant to take root and grow, which again, I mentioned those flood events. So those flood events come in, they snap the stalks of Japanese knotweed, wash them downstream, they wash up on the bank somewhere, take root, and you have a new infestation of Japanese knotweed further downstream. That also makes mechanical control pretty tricky because Japanese knotweed is also banned for sale, transport, introduction in New York, just like Japanese barberry. So those stalks, which are potential vectors for introduction, you really want to make sure that they're completely dead before you move them. Don't compost it because it will happily grow in compost. Smaller populations of newly introduced Japanese knotweed can be hand pulled. Again, I mentioned it before, intense repeated mechanical control can temporarily suppress a population of Japanese knotweed. I've seen it done to some success with hand pulling and really aggressive root grubbing. Every year, just coming in and removing any bit of Japanese knotweed from an area. Basically, it was to relieve some pressure around a lookout bench. The area was basically a forest of Japanese knotweed, and some volunteers came in and just root grubbed and hand pulled the knotweed in a small area around the bench to free it up to allow people to use the bench. And it worked. It's a lot of effort, but the bench area was free of Japanese knotweed. I've also seen it done with cutting the stalks back. Again, it's multiple times throughout the growing season, year after year after year, but it can work to remove Japanese knotweed from a specific area In the case I'm talking about, it was used to open up access to a stream for fishing and wading, and it worked pretty well. It's a lot of effort, but it can work. Goat grazing. Goats can digest Japanese knotweed enough that the knotweed remains will not take root and create new plants. So that's a great thing about using goats as control. Another thing is they're fairly passive in that you don't have to do the work beyond getting the goats on the property. They don't really work any better than that intense repeated mechanical control style of work. So you're probably not going to see eradication even with goat feeding pressure unless you're talking about 12 to 15 years for a really established population of Japanese knotweed. This portion of the presentation can be a little bit of a downer. So I'm going to mention that there is or there may be a biocontrol coming down the pipeline for Japanese knotweed. There was a knotweed psyllid, which is a sap-sucking insect that was approved for release in New York in 2 locations. It's obviously brand new. I think it was approved last year. It's brand new. It's still being studied for efficacy, how well it will help manage the Japanese knotweed, but it is a little bit of a light, a smidge of light at the end of the knotweed tunnel. And for those of you not familiar with biocontrols, biocontrol is short for biological control, and it's a term for whenever you bring in a predator or a pathogen disease from an invasive species' native range, with the intent that the biocontrol agent will target the invasive species and reduce its populations. The term has a lot of baggage pretty much everywhere across the world. There are a number of cases in our history where biocontrols were well-intentioned, released, and became problems themselves. That's not the case with this insect released for biocontrol. It's not the case for the insects released for emerald ash borer or hemlock woolly adelgid. All those insects represent the modern approach to biological control, in that they are required by the federal government to be target specific, which means the psyllids, the sap-sucking insects, can only feed and reproduce on Japanese knotweed. The predator beetles that are released for hemlock woolly adelgid can only feed and reproduce from feeding on hemlock woolly adelgid. It goes through really rigorous testing to make sure that's the case, to make sure they don't host switch even when there's a lack of their host food. It's really pretty safe. Since these modern standards for biocontrols have been instituted, there hasn't been a case of biocontrols escaping and becoming invasive. So that is just a sliver of hope in the effort against Japanese knotweed in the Catskills. The biocontrol is new and fresh, and hopefully will survive our winters and help to reduce populations everywhere. But aside from that, you're looking at a lot of physical effort to control Japanese knotweed. Oh, and actually, I almost forgot to mention, it's not on the slide here in terms of control methods, but some areas overseas have seen pretty good success with wire mesh smothering. So I know a lot of people here in the US talk about using really heavy tarps or weed mats to smother Japanese knotweed. It can work for some populations if they're not too dense and established, but really you want to combine it with some other form of control. So put out some weed mats and then go around and cut back stems that grow out from underneath them or pierce through the weed mats or tarps. And I mentioned those wire mesh. Basically, it's a steel wire mesh mat that gets put down over an area like you see in front of us, where Japanese knotweed is pretty much the only thing growing. And the mesh is fine enough that the Japanese knotweed can grow through it, and then it gets strangled as it grows and matures. And there are some areas that have seen some success with thinning out populations with that. Okay, moving on to Japanese stiltgrass, which is another very common invasive species. It is also prohibited for sale, transport, and introduction in New York State. So you're not supposed to be able to buy this anywhere. It is sort of a drooping erect grass. It has a very distinct light lime green color. It's not really, you can sort of see it in these pictures, the white midrib on some of the leaves. If my mouse is showing up, it's not really visible here, but I think I have another picture on the next slide. They're very shallowly rooted, which makes, as a sort of contrast to the previous species, mechanical control of Japanese stiltgrass is relatively easy, not very labor intensive unless the infestation is really widespread. And then late in the year, the stems will turn from a light yellow green to that purple. It loves very highly disturbed areas, forest edges. It'll happily, especially what we're seeing now with emerald ash borer taking out a large portion of our forests along roadways and in cities, is we're seeing Japanese stiltgrass move further into the forest edge with the increased light availability. And so you're starting to see Japanese stiltgrass penetrate further into the forests. I mentioned it's very shallowly rooted, which makes it pretty easy to pull up. And I think you can see the silver midrib here a little better. Oh, okay. Well, I was going to talk about this pretty soon anyway. So as far as control of Japanese stiltgrass, always manage stiltgrass and any invasive species if you can manage it before it produces seed or goes to flower. For small populations, or even large populations, if you have the wherewithal, you can hand pull them, bag them, let them dry, and then you can just dispose of them with your yard waste. For seeds, you want to really leave them out in the sun to bake and keep them before disposing of them. You can also cover the grass with a couple inches of mulch to prevent it from re-emerging. Anecdotally, I have heard that there are a number of ferns that are pretty aggressive and can outcompete Japanese stiltgrass. Other aggressive plants might work, mountain mint, depending on your site and the infestation of Japanese stiltgrass. But, you know, it's sort of trading one monoculture for another, especially with ferns, like hay-scented fern. It's not a big food source, so you're trading an aggressive native for an invasive, right? So just be aware of that. Okay, moving on to honeysuckles. We have 4 invasive species of honeysuckle in New York State. 3 of them are shrubs, and 1 of them is a vine. So we have Amur honeysuckle, Maro's honeysuckle, and Tartarian honeysuckle, all of which are the shrub invasives. And there's a couple hybrids, Bell's honeysuckle, and then there's Japanese honeysuckle, which is the vine. All 4 are prohibited for sale, transport, and introduction in New York State, which means you're not supposed to be able to buy them. We do have native honeysuckles, and a really great way to tell the invasives from the natives is that you can cut into the stem of any honeysuckle. The invasives, all four of these and the hybrids will have hollow stems, and the natives will have solid pith in the center of the stem. So if you're not sure, you can look for that, and you'll know right away. The hollow is the invasive, and you can make your management decisions based off of that. As far as IDing the shrub species, Tartarian honeysuckle has really deep pink flowers. It also has, I mean, the leaves are pretty variable, so I wouldn't depend on the leaves completely for ID. Wait for them to flower to help tell the species apart. But Tartarian honeysuckle has deep pink flowers. Maro's honeysuckle has the white petaled flowers. And Emer honeysuckle has yellow petaled flowers and these really sharply pointed lanceolate leaves here. You can tell the leaves are a little different between the three species, but wait for them to flower unless you're very confident. Okay, as far as, oh man, I didn't realize how aggressive that picture of the fire looked until I saw it full size on my screen here. Honeysuckle management, always manage prior to seed production. Hand removal works very well for honeysuckles. Repeat cutting back of the above ground biomass, followed by root grubbing, either with shovels or with a weed wrench, which is a really great tool. Basically, it's a gigantic pry bar, like a 6 foot long pry bar that you can jimmy like at the base of a stem. It has a metal grasping end, and then you just use leverage to haul the root mass out. It's very useful if you have a large number of invasive shrubs that you're interested in tackling yourself. Look into weed wrenches. Just like Japanese barberry, prescribed burns can work very well for large stands, but again, professionals should be the ones doing this, not, if you don't have training with prescribed burns or directed flame weeding, look for someone who does have that training. Okay, moving on to Multiflora Rose. Another extremely common invasive shrub that we have throughout the Catskills. It has a multi-stemmed, thorny, arcing growth habit. Sorry about that. It's not that tall as a shrub. I don't tend to see it 12 feet tall, maybe more like 6 to 8 feet tall. Has these recurved thorns that just really grab into you. I think barberry is a little worse because the thorns are so thin, it feels like it can pierce through anything. But you know, you pick your poison. It's got, so Multiflora Rose also has pinnately compound leaves, usually with 11 leaflets per leaf, but it is variable. It's got bright red thorns. There's my mouse, it keeps falling asleep there. And it's fairly showy with its flowers. As far as control of Multiflora Rose, just checking the time here. IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. I apologize if I have referenced that and not explained it before. Integrated Pest Management basically means combining multiple control methods to achieve higher success. Usually you hear it used when you're talking about combining chemicals and mechanical control, but I mentioned using cutting and root grubbing in the previous slides. That is integrated pest management just as well. Repeat cutting multiple times per growing season can work to eventually, over multiple years, kill off infestations of Multiflora Rose. Thorough root grubbing can work very well. Goat grazing works very well for Multiflora Rose. I want to bring up biocontrols for this one as well. I don't have it listed on the slide because the rosette virus does attack invasive roses, but it also attacks and kills native roses. Sometimes within 2 years. It's for this reason that it's not intentionally released as a biocontrol. It's not recommended that people do it, especially if they have native roses around, because again, the disease is non-discriminatory. It's non-target specific. It'll attack the natives just as well as the invasives. So this is a case where there is a disease that targets the invasive, but it's so broad that it's not used for biocontrols. Okay, I mentioned this guy very early in the presentation, wild parsnip. This is one that if you're driving along any of the highways through the Catskills, you'll see this everywhere along abandoned fields, along roadsides, sometimes even in people's yards. Anywhere with really heavy disturbance, heavy human disturbance, I should say, is prime real estate for wild parsnip, which is really awful because it does create these really huge near monocultures where it grows, and it does represent a big potential for harm to human health. It has these a rosette of pinnately compound leaves, and then it has flowers in pretty large yellow umbels, maybe up to 8 inches, 10 inches, maybe a little big. And then you'll see the seeds in the stalks, the brown stalks, persist through winter. As far as control goes, this is luckily another one that's fairly straightforward in terms of control. Cutting it back can work pretty well prior to seed production. Root grubbing can also work to reduce infestations. If the seed has set, you want to clip and bag the seed heads. You don't really have to worry at that point about digging up the plant itself because the plant will die back at that point. Just clip and bag the seed heads, leave them in the sun for in a bag in the sun for like 2 or 3 weeks. And then you can dispose of them. Repeated mowing after flower production and before seed set works pretty well as well. You need that repeat mowing basically to avoid them reflowering. I have this picture here of this guy doing it. He's not, in the picture, he's not mowing wild parsnip, which is why I think he's comfortable with his sleeves rolled up. For wild parsnip, you always want pretty intense personal protective equipment, PPE, because wild parsnip can cause severe burns. It has a chemical in it, furanocoumarins, which is a solution which can react to your skin and cause severe photosensitivity, which basically means that your skin will be really, really sensitive to sunlight. So if you're exposed to the sap of this plant and you stay out in the sun, you will develop the worst sunburn of your life. I'm not sure I have pictures of it. I don't think I do, but we're talking, hospitalization in most cases of exposure to furanocoumarins, whether wild parsnip or giant hogweed. So if you have wild parsnip on your property and you want to control it, gloves, long pants, long shirt sleeves, and goggles, actually, because furanocoumarins can impact your eyesight as well. And especially if you're mowing, the droplets can become suspended in the air. So goggles are a must if you're mowing, for sure. That being said, I'm really hammering home how dangerous this is, but at CRISP, part of our work is controlling all of the giant hogweed that occurs throughout the 3.3 million acres of the Catskill watershed. That varies between like 11 and 16 sites, depending on, some become officially eradicated each year and we get some new ones reported. I've been working on giant hogweed pretty intimately with mechanical control alone for 5 years, and I've never been burned by it. So as bad as the potential is, it's also pretty easy to mitigate it with, again, that personal protective equipment. So the things to keep in mind are the chemicals are released when the stems or leaves are crushed or broken, or if you come to a site and there's been some animal grazing, that's another potential vector. So just you have to worry most if you're brushing up against those crushed or broken leaves or stems. Whole plants are less of a risk, still a risk. If you experience contact, you want to immediately cover whatever area, your arm or your leg or your neck that was exposed. Wash it as soon as possible. I always recommend soap and water for a wild parsnip, even though, well, actually, I don't know if it's a water-soluble solution in wild parsnip. In giant hogweed, it is. You can technically wash off the solution with water only if you're exposed from giant hogweed. I don't know if it's water-soluble in wild parsnip. So again, I always recommend soap and water. If a burn develops, go to the doctor, get it assessed, and keep the area out of sunlight. Pre-burn, if you've been exposed, you want to keep that area of your skin covered for like 48 hours to avoid getting that burn. If you do burn, you might be looking at severe sun sensitivity for that area for up to 2 years in the worst cases. So it's something that you really want to be careful around. Again, for giant hogweed, not wild parsnip, but giant hogweed, if you know where some giant hogweed is growing, you can report it to me. My job is to deal with it so that other people don't have to. So for that plant, at least, you can report it to us and we will go out, confirm it, and control it for you. All right, moving on from the horror of wild parsnip to Eurasian or Oriental bittersweet. This is a climbing woody vine with sort of egg-shaped alternate leaves. They have this finely toothed margin around them. How are we doing on time? We're doing okay on time, I think. It can be mistaken for American bittersweet. The leaves, there is some differentiation with the leaves, but they're so variable that I'd really recommend taking a look at the fruit capsules. The invasive fruit capsule is yellow, and the native American bittersweet fruit capsule is orange to like orangey red. That's a much stronger indicator of which species you're dealing with. And it does spread through seed, and it spreads via root suckering, which can make manual control of this a little bit of a pain. This is, yet again, a species that really loves old abandoned fields, hedgerows, forest edges. It's particularly insidious because it grows up a forest edge and girdles the trees and shades them out, killing the trees on the forest edge, taking them down, and then moving on to that newly exposed forest edge, shrinking a forest slowly from the outside. Oh no, I left chemical treatments in here. Ignore that. Small infestations of Oriental bittersweet can be hand dug pretty easily. Larger infestations, large established cases like this, where we're talking about a vine maybe the size of like a dinner plate in some cases, you're talking many years of control if you're only doing cutting. Root grubbing can be done. It can help. Again, that integrated pest management can really work wonders to increase the efficacy of your control. Goat grazing does work, not for individuals like this, but for smaller, newer infestations that might be climbing over small trees or shrubs. Goat grazing can work very well to suppress Oriental bittersweet populations. Moving on to mugwort. which again, one of those species that is prohibited. Oh, I should have said that Oriental bittersweet is also prohibited for sale in New York State. Mugwort is prohibited for sale as well. It, you know, I've heard anecdotally about its medicinal properties. It certainly has a very strong, I think pretty pleasant smell when you crush the foliage. But I can't say yay or nay whether it actually does have any effects medicinally, but it was introduced for that reason. It spreads pretty aggressively through extensive root mats, which makes it really tough to, this is actually a plant that's really tough to get rid of, whether you're doing mechanical or chemical control, but I won't get too in depth on that second one. It gets about 5 or 6 feet tall, has these pretty attractive, deeply lobed leaves with some variation. You can see in this picture the leaves appear a little different. And they have a really nice silver sheen to the underside of their leaves. So when you see them, infestations of mugwort blowing in the breeze, you'll see like dark green and then silver as it blows. It looks pretty nice. It's a really awful plant, but it looks good. As far as control of this plant goes, this is one that you really just need to be tenacious about. Repeat cutting or mowing multiple times per growing season, multiple years in a row, may work to suppress a population. We had some success when we had the personnel to support it with repeated mowing of patches of mugwort at the Thorn Preserve in Woodstock. It did reduce the density of a patch of mugwort. Unfortunately, we were only able to do that for, I think, 2 years, and that's not enough to eradicate it. You need, again, tenacity for dealing with mugwort. Integrated pest management can work very well. Repeat cutting and mowing combined with root grubbing to remove those root mats from the outer edges can shrink a population over time, while again thinning out the interior from the mowing or cutting. Oh, is it? Okay, there we go. Moving on to garlic mustard, another prohibited plant. For sale, transport, or movement. Sorry, I was getting distracted with the chat there. Another prohibited plant for sale, transport, or movement in New York State. It's a biennial, low-growing plant. It likes very like wetter side of highly disturbed areas. It is edible. I neglected to mention that Japanese knotweed, also edible. I've had garlic mustard in a pesto. It was fine as a pesto. Certainly, if you have a large population of garlic mustard, you can hand pull it. Well, you know, if you trust it not to have been contaminated with heavy metals and stuff, you can pull it and munch on it as part of your local management effort. I wouldn't necessarily choose it over other ingredients for pesto, but it was good. I feel the same about Japanese knotweed. I had it replacing rhubarb in a strawberry rhubarb pie, and it was okay. I've heard some people make muffins with it. I've heard of Japanese knotweed sushi. Haven't tried those. But if you have populations of those plants, that's something you can do. All right. Oh. As far as invasiveness, garlic mustard is incredibly aggressive, creates these huge, thick, dense monocultures that completely shades out other herbaceous plants from growing in the area, completely crowds out spring ephemerals, and it reduces insect diversity by pushing out that crucial native food source for those native insects, because they don't get, they either don't get any or they don't get as much benefit from garlic mustard as their preferred species. Anecdotally, again, I have heard that native ferns can work to outcompete garlic mustard. I've heard that golden ragwort can outcompete garlic mustard, but again, you're trading a aggressive native for an invasive. You know, think about your priorities. A native is better than an invasive, but if you're looking to increase your biodiversity in an area, you're trading your monoculture for another. Hand pulling works very well when the soil is moist for garlic mustard, but you have to beat back that seed bank, and so you're looking at many, many years of work. Always pull before seed set, because if you let them go to seed, you're just resetting that timer of how long you have to deal with it. Repeated mowing works well to prevent seed set, as long as you're mowing with your mower set low to the ground. If you mow too high, you risk the flowers and seeds re-emerging. Controlled burns work pretty well for garlic mustard, but you're looking at multiple years because you have to beat back that seed bank. And deer exclusion. This is one that I should have had on probably every species that I've talked about tonight. But in particular, garlic mustard, if you can fence deer out of an area, garlic mustard has a chemical feedback effect where eventually the garlic mustard will exclude itself. I mean, we're talking over the course of like 7 or more years. So it's the same relative time frame of cutting or root grubbing versus just fencing the deer out, but eventually the garlic mustard will exclude itself from an area without deer coming in. So that's another option for control of garlic mustard. And for any of these species, if you're pulling them out of an area, you're cutting them back, you're removing them, you should be restoring the area with natives. In particular, I would look for things that create massive monocultures like Japanese knotweed or Japanese barberry that can create these really thick, extensive patches in a forest understory. Look at the native trees and shrubs that are growing at that site for hints as to what you can revegetate with after you've dealt with the invasive plants. And when you do restoration work, think about deer exclusion, whether you're doing tree tubes or deer fencing or whatever. You need to keep the deer away from the natives. Deer will preferentially not eat invasives. They love many of our natives. So keep that in mind when you're starting control work. Time, it is 8 o'clock. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly through the invasive plant management decision analysis tool. If you have an infestation of a invasive species, this tool is a free browser-based tool. You can go through the web for it. Can help you decide whether or not it's practical to start on eradication or suppression. It'll help you focus your goals. It'll help you get an idea of the time frame you're looking at based on your infestation's particular factors of like time since introduction, how extensive it is. A couple square meters is very different from half an acre. It's a really great tool. It's free to use. It is more focused on professional managers than private landowners, but that just means that some of the questions aren't applicable to you and you can basically ignore them when you're filling it out. I'm going to skip this and move forward because we want to get to the Q&A portion. But basically the IPM DAT will prompt you for each of these steps. And these are all things that you need to take into account when you're starting an invasive plant management effort. You want to, well, first confirm that the invasive is what you think it is, and then learn about the plant. Its particular biological characteristics will inform what management techniques are appropriate to the plant. I've covered some of them tonight, but when to do them. You can also look at what others have done to treat this species, either in your local area or elsewhere. You can talk to your local PRISM, me or my coworker, John Thompson. You can look to your local Cornell Cooperative Extension, or go to the New York State Research Institute. You can also check IMAP. I mentioned this earlier, but IMAP Invasives is a public database. So while anyone can put data in, you can also go to the website and look up species and see what treatments people have done. Both professional managers and members of the public are putting that information in. I shouldn't say members of the public, because professional managers are also members of the public. But IMAP Invasives has that information there for free. So you can go to that database and look it up and see. In some cases, you can see how you can see the treatment they did, and you can actually map, like see it on a map, how the population has shrunk over time, or if it's continued to grow, which would tell you whether the treatment is working or not. It's a really great tool. It's free to use. Everyone should use it. Check out your infestation, get a handle on the scale of the infestation, the extent of it, is it specific to your property or on neighboring properties. If it's on a neighboring property, was it introduced to your property from them, vice versa? Did it come from upstream or construction equipment? Before and after pictures are really great. It's mostly directed at professionals, but it can still be good to keep your morale up. You know, in year 7 of suppressing Japanese knotweed, you can look back at year 1 and wow, I've done a lot. Think about what management techniques are appropriate for the site factors. You know, mowing may not be appropriate in some areas. You might have to go in for manual cutting. Root grubbing may be more or less difficult in some areas of the Catskills with our extremely rocky soils. Really, I encourage everyone to think about the timeline for a species control effort, because it's really easy to start an invasive management project, do year 1, year 2, and then it gets to year 6 or 7, and you're still controlling it, and you lose heart. It helps at the beginning to know what you're getting into with an invasive plant. So have a good estimate, a good handle on how long it's going to take, and if you can do post-management effort, post-management restoration work. Also, you can get a good handle on if restoration work is appropriate mid-management, right? So for some things like Japanese knotweed, unless you're doing really aggressive mechanical control, like multiple, you know, once a week or once every other week, coming back and cutting the stems back, I would really recommend waiting for the population to thin out before planting natives in an area of Japanese knotweed infestation. Whereas I wouldn't recommend doing restoration work like if you're not able to do that very aggressive control for Japanese knotweed, I would recommend waiting until your chosen management style has eradicated the Japanese knotweed from an area before planting something native, because you risk the knotweed. Like if you can only come back once a year, you risk the knotweed shading out what you plant. Other things to consider: permits, not necessarily relevant to this because we're not really considering pesticides. Again, what the public's perception of the project will be, it's your property. And think about a budget for it. Again, it's similar to the timeline. If you will need specific tools to address it, like those weed wrenches, that kind of thing. These are all things to consider at the beginning, and they can help you focus your goals on eradication or control, which is sort of keep it as is, or suppression, which is very slowly thin out the population. All right, I zoomed through that stuff. going to talk a little bit about IMAP invasives. I'm not going to talk through every single slide because I don't have enough time. But basically, IMAP invasives is New York's chosen invasive species database. It's free to use. You can use it through your browser. You can use it on your phone through 2 different apps now. There's the IMAP invasives mobile app, which is right here, which is very straightforward and simple to use. And there's a more in-depth tool which allows you to draw on a map the actual extent of an infestation. It's way more specific if you like getting into that. That's through a Survey 123 app. IMAP invasive tracks presence and absence of invasive species, control efforts, end results. It shows all of this information on a map, which is again available to the public, and it has early detection alerts, which professionals like myself and my coworker John Thompson, other prisms, will get these email alerts basically when a new invasive species, new to the database, is reported within an area. So places that don't have hemlock woolly adelgid will get email alerts when the first hemlock woolly adelgid presence record is uploaded to IMAP invasives, and that makes that early detection work very straightforward. This, again, can support your work because it has information on control methods and results. It also supports our work at the regional level because it gives us a better handle on the actual presence and distribution of these invasive plants and insects and animals. It supports all species listed as invasive in the state, and actually not just the state. It is actually international now. Parts of Canada are using it. Other states are using IMAP invasive. Okay. I'm not going to go through all this. I'm just going to go through it. Just we're getting a pretty good handle on. This is what you'll see when you go to IMAP invasives. Sorry, got distracted by the chat again. Where the orange dots represent the number of reports of an invasive species in an area. We're pretty zoomed out, so you see some of these circles represent greater than 10,000 species records. Also note that some species records are from the same infestation over multiple years. So that 10,000 may actually represent closer to like 6,000 or 7,000 individual infestations. When you zoom in, the orange dots break up into green and pink circles and polygons, which basically represent individual reports. This, again, works very similar to Google Maps, how you can scroll and pan, zoom in and out with your mouse. It does have some management tools, like you can do a measure of an area to see how big of an area is infested with it, an invasive. You can also query it to say, like, what are these 7 species in this box I've drawn? You can click that and it'll tell you. It's a really versatile tool. It's also very simple to use in terms of uploading stuff. The app is very straightforward. I'm sorry, I'm zipping through all these slides. We want to get to the Q&A. So I'm just going to, I'll actually just stop sharing my screen here. And say thank you for coming to this presentation, and we can start the Q&A portion now.
Okay. Can you see me? All right. So I just wanted, we have some great questions, and that was a great presentation, Dan. Thank you for that. I took a bunch of notes nonstop. So we have first Elizabeth, who mentions about knotweed, Japanese knotweed, that she's collected a lot of roots, and she has them in contractor bags, and was wondering how to handle that.
Yeah, so if you don't want to wait, leave it out in the, so you can leave Japanese knotweed roots and cut stems in bags in the sun for pretty long periods of time, and they bake and die, and then you can dispose of them. There are landfills that are approved for disposal of Japanese knotweed. So you can also take it there, and they basically use heat to kill it. There's some compost facilities will have high enough heat to kill them, but not all. So definitely call ahead and ask specifically. But the most reliable way is just to leave the contractor bags in full sun for several weeks before disposal.
Several weeks, wow.
Yeah.
Great. There's also another related question that was asked later on about chipping up. This person, one of the attendees, it's anonymous, that was honeysuckle, common buckthorn, multiflora rose, and collected it from the understory, as much as over 600 pounds of it, and was wondering if they can, if the chips, if they were to chip them up, would there be allopathic chemicals that in the chips, and would they be still present, or should they burn them?
I don't know how long allelopathic chemicals, I don't know the half-life for them. I would need to look at the specific species and see how quickly the chemicals are broken down. It really depends a lot on, in terms of chemical breakdown, it frequently depends on sun exposure and exposure to whatever bacteria will break those chemicals down. It's unfortunately, I just don't know the answer, but if you want to email me at, I think I can put my email in the chat. If you want to email me, I am more than happy to look into that and get back to you about that. But I can tell you just offhand, it would, if there were allelopathic chemicals present in wood chips, it would, the breakdown time would vary based on that chemical and how the wood chips have been stored.
Okay, great, super. So there it is. So you can look that up in the chat for Dan's email. So Alex mentioned that was asking about the presentation, whether it's going to be available, and I can answer that. It's yes, it will be available on our website on the pollinator pathway, and Caroline will talk about that later. You mentioned some biological controls for Japanese knotweed. I guess one person asked about Cornell project and some bacteria or enemies that are used for Japanese knotweed, and you mentioned that in the presentation. Do you want to elaborate on that at all? Or?
Yeah, so it's the one that was approved for release is a sap-sucking insect, which means it has piercing mouth parts, which it sticks into the stem or the leaf and will suck the sap out of the plant. Some of them, I don't know the specifics about the knotweed psyllid, P-S-Y-L-L-I-D, I think it's spelled. If it also injects a chemical into the knotweed, frequently they will inject a chemical into the plant to, which has some side effects on causing leaf death, but not always. I can tell you that in general, for a biocontrol to be approved for release, it has to show a likelihood of actually impacting the invasive species growth or reproduction. So the psyllid has shown some impact on either Japanese knotweed growth rate, or it impacts its reproduction rate. It also, again, has to show that it's target specific before it's approved for release, which this was. So it must, it basically can only feed on Japanese knotweed. It's not that it prefers it. It actually has to feed on Japanese knotweed or it dies, which is really great because it means it won't switch to anything else that's growing in the same area. What that also means is that because the biocontrol agent is dependent on the invasive, the Japanese knotweed, it will stay and move with the invasive plant, right? So the insect, the psyllid will seek out, as it reproduces and the population of the biocontrol agent grows, they will start to seek out other populations of Japanese knotweed and they'll spread on their own, so we don't have to keep going around and introducing it manually. Eventually the populations of the biocontrol will be such that they'll spread naturally and reduce the population of Japanese knotweed. I don't think I mentioned it in the presentation, but I should say that specifically for biological control, eradication is never the goal. And the reason for that is there's a lot of effort that goes into rearing, so growing these biological control agents frequently in laboratory settings before releasing them. And then you frequently have to go back and do supplemental releases to bolster the populations in the same area before it can get really established and get strong foothold. There's a lot of effort that goes into introducing these and helping them grow their populations. And if the Japanese knotweed is eradicated by the biological control, the biological controls die out, and then there's a potential that the invasive plant could be reintroduced, and then you have to go through all that effort of reintroducing, bolstering the biocontrol population. The goal of biocontrol agents is to reduce the impact of an invasive plant or insect or animal such that it's no longer impacting the ecosystem it's growing in. It's sort of forcing the plant to act like it's naturalized by reducing its growth rate or its reproduction rate so it's more in line with natives and it's not out-competing them. Specifically about the psyllid releases, I know it's been released in 2 locations in New York State as of like November of last year. I don't know about their plans for either releasing at new locations or bolstering those release sites.
Cool, great. Dave asked a couple questions about garden centers and how to, what is being done to prevent the sale of invasive species, probably like Japanese barberry and things like that.
Yeah, so as far as preventing local garden centers from selling invasive species, the law is that they can't sell the prohibited species, and then there are regulated species that are allowed to be sold under certain conditions. Again, I mentioned that there are 4 cultivars of Japanese barberry that can be sold because they are sterile, but if they ever are shown to be spreading, they will move to the prohibited list. Basically, if you see a garden center spreading invasives, either by selling them or in some cases, some garden centers will unintentionally be spreading invasives that might be, growing in a pot or a seed ball alongside the native. You can report it to Ag and Markets, and they'll come out and take a look. I mean, it's really hard, it's a lot of manpower to go and keep watch over everyone who's selling plants. It's basically like, here's a list of things that are dangerous to sell, right? Don't sell them, and then it's on the garden centers to not sell them or be reported for it by people like us who know what to look for.
So another question related to that, after about alternative native shrubs to plant. I think you have a great hand that I've seen as a substitute for invasive plants.
I
Do
have a,
you want to comment on alternative native shrubs that after the have been removed, the invasive plants have been removed? What would you suggest in terms of alternative native plants to replace those areas?
okay. My audio was clipping a little bit, but I think the gist of it is looking for native shrubs that can be planted after removing invasives. So it's very dependent on your goals as a property owner, right? If you're looking for something that's showy and ornamental, or if you're looking for something that will support specific pollinators and attract them to your property at certain life stages. If you're just looking to support your sort of local biodiversity, your site will determine what else is growing around where you are. So it's site dependent. There are some really good tools that are available, and there's a really great tool that's up and coming to help people determine what species are appropriate for what sites. The New York State Integrated Pest Management site on cornell.edu will specifically talk about some native alternatives to ornamental plants that appear on the prohibited and regulated plant list. That's a very good tool for options that are showy in the same way as some of these ornamental invasive plants. If you're lucky enough to live on a creek or a stream or a riverside, the Trees for Tribs program is really, really wonderful, both with, in some cases, helping remove invasives and with helping you plan a restoration effort. It's free to apply to, and they, in some cases, will offer help with labor. Let's see, I brought this up before in my email, if I can find it. Oh man, I don't appear to have it still open, so the name escapes me. But I know that there is internally a large PDF being worked on for native species that lists ideal site conditions. It was circulated as a draft sometime last year. I haven't seen any, I don't know what state it's in now, but it's something to keep an eye out for. I wish I'll supply the answer to Adam, and he can have the name of that to keep an eye out for it when it's published.
Cool. So let's see. One question about specifically about garlic mustard that Barbara asked concerning what to do with the material after they collect it. Do you require like drying it out, or how do you dispose of that? Can you compost it? Things like that.
Which species was that?
Garlic mustard.
Yeah, so if it has flowered, you need to be very careful with it because it can go to seed once you've pulled. So that's one that you want to bag and leave in the sun, again, for to bake and die before disposal.
So that's pretty much you would do pretty much with all the invasives that are collected and bagged. You should heat them up and then for several days.
Yeah.
Yeah, in this full sun, and then dispose of them.
Yeah. If it's cloudy for a couple of days, that really won't cut it. You need that high heat from the sun exposure.
Yes. Judith asked a question about wild parsnip. Is that related to edible parsnip that is eaten?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? I don't think so either.
Yeah, they are related. it is safe to grow vegetables for your own use in your garden. You don't have to worry about vegetables spreading aggressively, I don't think. Oh, I will also say,
Okay.
I know, so there are about 40 species of giant hogweed, or relatives of giant hogweed. And some of them are edible. I actually, at one of our giant hogweed sites, I met a neighbor to that site who came up to us, asked us what we were doing. We chatted a little bit about it, and he actually asked me if I would leave some of the, if I'd, cut the flower heads off and leave the stalks for him to come back and harvest later. I guess you can do some pickling procedure, and some of the species are edible. I would never recommend doing it with giant hogweed or wild parsnip unless you're very sure of yourself.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. We have a lot of them are very similar questions. Judith asked a question about the IMAP invasive. There does not seem to be a way to locate and save the location on my property for long-term interaction. Do you find, do I have to find it on the map of the United States every time? Did you get that?
There should be a button somewhere on the map that you can click that will center where you are if you've given permission for the browser to get access to your location data through your modem. Or so there should be a button for that will center it, and then you have to zoom in. But yeah, every time you go to the map, it will center it, and you'll have to like do some scrolling whether or not you center it first.
Okay. Also, there was someone that asked about, if you're going for a walk and you see an infestation in a woodland area that you don't belong, or maybe it's a public area, what should you do?
The easiest thing you can do is download the IMAP Invasives app, make an account totally free, and it's like probably 30 seconds to just plop down a GPS point with the app for wherever you see the infestation, say what species it is, take a quick picture of it, and upload it to the database. Again, all that information is reviewed by state-recognized experts, and so they'll go through your uploaded information, confirm from the picture whether or not you've got the right species, and if you do, it'll be marked as confirmed in IMAP Invasives, which will then go on to inform management efforts. Some species like, and the management efforts that are decided on will depend on the site. If you're in a state park, actually in the Catskills, the Catskill Center operates a strike team that's specifically focused on state campgrounds within the blue line. And so even some common species like Japanese barberry and Japanese knotweed are targeted for management efforts by that strike team, separate from CRISP, because CRISP focuses on those early detection species, and the Catskill Center strike team focuses on more common species within the campgrounds. But even common species, depending on site, will be targeted for management if it's in IMAP invasives. If it's an early detection species, which you can see the tier 2s or early detection species, I tend to use the terms interchangeably. You can go to catskillinvasives.com, which is the website for CRISP, and we have our early detection species up on the website. If you report those are species that CRISP will work on. CRISP staff will go out, we'll talk with the landowners, we'll figure out a management effort that works both to eradicate the species and that is okay with the landowner, and we'll deal with it that way. But the best way to, I guess, short answer long, the best way to, the best thing to do is to report it on IMAP Invasives, because then whoever's managing that property has access to that information through that free database.
Cool. Can you repeat the name of the site that helps with streamside management?
The Trees for Tribs program is the one. Again, you do have to be, streamside or creekside, but they do really fantastic work. Yeah,
I've worked with them, and they are a great group. So it's fun being able to plant some native species, in the area that's really devastated with. We did that at the Woodsuck Land Conservancy site once. I think that pretty much covers our question and answer. We've extended it a little bit further than we had intended. So I'm going to pass this on to Caroline to close out the program. And thank you so much, Dan. That was very informative, and I look forward to listening to it again and catching up with some of the things I may have missed.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Great. So Caroline?
All right. Boy, that was a lot to digest. So big thank you again to everyone who contributed to tonight's program, especially Dan. That was a marathon and you paced yourself. Dell, thanks for doing that Q&A, and Adam behind the scenes doing a great job coordinating, and all the rest of the Pollinator Pathway Planning Committee, always thinking of the next thing. If you joined us tonight via Zoom, you will receive a follow-up email, and that will have, the information in writing for you that we've been talking about tonight. So if you missed something, don't worry, you'll get it in that email. It will also have the link to the recording of tonight's webinar. So don't forget that it's quick and easy to join the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway at our website, which is woodstocknypollinatorpathway.org. If you're ready to avoid the use of pesticides and herbicides and nurture native pollinator-friendly plants, let us know that you're part of the project by taking a minute or two to click on the join link and give us the information for our pathway map, and to subscribe to the informative newsletters that are put together. We have more programs in the works, but I don't have the specific information for you tonight, but stay tuned and we'll let you know about future webinars and maybe some live activities even as we move into spring and we can get together outdoors. So the webinars are recorded and posted on YouTube within a few days. So you can watch any programs that you missed. There are some really good ones. And you can find that list and all the links at that Pollinator Pathway website. So thank you so much for being with us. And that concludes our program for tonight. Good night.